because they feel that, insurance is important because they do want to get immediate access to private healthcare, because many a times the waiting time, the overcrowded ward, and so they're borrowing or they're taking loans to pay off.
Hello and welcome to the show where we discuss health and medical issues. I'm T. Shao Ik. It's our public health series today, and we will be discussing an issue that a lot of people had to start the year with quite a lot of trepidation and anxiety over these letters that they would be getting, and that's the letters that you'll be getting from your insurance company telling you about the hike in your premiums. Now, there has been a bit of relief for some policyholders because there was news that the premiums wouldn't be increased by 40 to 70% this year, as had previously been announced by the industry. But this is just a temporary reprieve. What happens after 2026, when the higher adjustments will likely be inevitable to reflect the increasing cost of healthcare? As always, joining me for the Public Health series is my co-host, Azrul Muhammad Khalib, CEO of the Galen Centre for Health and Social Policy. And our guest today is Dato' Indrani, Thuraisingham, Vice President of FOMCA. Dato', thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm good. And how are you?
Very well, thank you. We did also reach out to Bank Negara Malaysia to request if they could send a representative. However, they were unable to make it. And I just want to provide a bit of context before we jump into the conversation, because I want to share the statements, or rather excerpts of statements from the insurance industry as well as from private hospitals in response to this news of the news of the hike in the medical premiums, as well as later Bank Negara's announcement. So the insurance industry's rationale was that between 2021 and 2023, the industry has experienced unprecedented medical claims cost inflation of 56%, and hence the need to increase premiums of policyholders. Private hospitals chimed in to say that adjustments must ensure equity, that the private hospital sector has consistently endeavoured to optimise costs to make healthcare affordable while ensuring sustainability. So with that in the back of our minds, Azrul, can I get you to just very quickly recap sort of where we are now? Because there were a lot of statements coming out, and perhaps some listeners or consumers are still confused.
Well, shall we? I don't know if we can do it quickly, but definitely it's a long journey really to get to where we are today. It really started February last year, really, with the note that was issued by Bank Negara on wanting to get a handle on healthcare inflation, specifically concerning insurance claims. And what at that point in time it was to ensure that more of the health insurance and takaful providers would be providing products that would be having co-payments and deductibles in the products that they'll be pitching to policyholders, and something that Bank Negara has indicated that it would be easing into beginning this year, meaning there'll be no more of the cashless types that we would have. And then mid-year, we started to see people start to receive notices of notification that their policies would be revised according to a certain percentage. I myself received mine in August, looking at a revision of my existing policy by 40%. But a lot of other people saw basically between 20 to even 200% increases, in terms of the policies that they were expected to pay. And this is quite worrying, because there is this insinuation that addressing the healthcare inflation issue, which is for Malaysia reportedly around 12.6% for the past couple of years, and supposed to be up to 15% this year and onwards, is going to be on the shoulders of policyholders, consumers, patients. And so this is where we are today, where we're starting the year with basically a lot of people who've received their letters already, making the decision whether or not to continue on with their insurance policies, whether they can afford private healthcare, or even whether they should have insurance at all for themselves. And this is something that is quite worrying. But as you said, there's been quite a number of announcements, and one of the positive things that have come out is the cap, so to speak, of a 10% increase for the next 3 years. So it hasn't decreased, or been frozen. It's just capped at 10% increase per year for the next 3 years. But then, we'll have to ask the question, what happens after that? But also for those who are age 60, the good news is that for them, they will not be affected by the increases for at least a year. So this is one of the things that we were concerned about, for those who are vulnerable or needing some form of health insurance to at least be able to be comforted in this period to retain their policies as they have had over the past couple of years. So that's where we are sort of at the moment.
And Dato' Indrani, from FOMCA's perspective, what is your response to, I guess, the moves in the insurance industry related to health insurance, as well as Bank Negara's announcements to cap it at 10% over that 3-year period?
Our point of view is that it's not sustainable, and it's only a kind of a band-aid kind of a solution. We need to look deeper into the factors of why this is happening, and why our medical inflation rates are so high. Compared to the global average of 10%. Ours is extremely high. We look at other neighboring countries, they're much lower than us. And what is the reason behind that? And this is not something that just happened last year. It's been happening. It's gradually been happening. We've raised this issue with Bank Negara a couple of times. We've had dialogues with them. And, they did acknowledge the issue, but nothing was done. But especially in the last 6 months, as what Azrul mentioned, we've been receiving too many complaints. As he mentioned, people who had to pay premiums, like for example 300 over ringgit per month, were now asked to pay about 800 ringgit per month per policy. And that's only one person in the household. What about the whole family? And so they told us, they said, if FOMCA is not able to help us, then we just have to give up the policy because we can't afford. And that's why we feel that the government has to take a kind of more strengthened position, and look at it from the perspective of universal healthcare. If we are talking about private healthcare insurance, we are talking about maybe about 20 to 30% of the population. So the rest of the population are still going to the public healthcare system. So how can we kind of moderate this and ensure that we have access to healthcare, that all of us, irrespective of whether we can pay or not, actually have access to healthcare?
What exactly is FOMCA able to offer in terms of support to those who come to you? We compile these complaints, and when we then demand for some sort of a dialogue with Bank Negara, and where we have shared these the complaints, because many of them share with us the notifications of their increase in premium. So we have evidence of how much they used to pay. Some I think even before June, we had one company saying from 800 it was going to 2,000 over ringgit. And that was like ridiculous, and the argument is that, because of excess of claims, and looking at the amounts and the number of people, and that's why it's gone up to about 2,000 over ringgit. And so we thought that these were really very exorbitant amounts, and we channeled this to Bank Negara. Because we're not able to do much. We can only mediate. We can only send these complaints to the respective, vendors or businesses, and hope that they would, take action. But if not, then we have to end up going to the regulator and requesting the regulator, that is BNM, to do something about it. So it was, first at the moment it was on a case-to-case basis, but then we found that, too many complaints were coming to us. And that's why we've been raising this issue for the last couple of months in the media as well. And we have also sent letters to the Minister of Finance as well as Bank Negara to say that we are not happy, and we hope that there's a much more holistic view that is taken in terms of looking at both the insurance industry as well as the healthcare service, especially from the private side as well. What have you heard in terms of worst case actions that they are forced to take simply because the premiums have gone beyond what they can afford? Do you have any examples you can share?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just say two. One, of course, they just give up their policies, and second, they're then now trying to take private loans to pay.
Wow.
And that's a little bit scary because I mean, if you look at what is happening to the US now, people are becoming bankrupt because of medical costs. So you have this thing called the medical bankrupts, and we may be leading towards that, where, because they feel that, insurance is important because they do want to get access to, quick healthcare, because many a times the waiting time, the overcrowded wards and so on. So many of them want to have immediate access to private healthcare. So, they want to maintain, and so they're borrowing or they're taking loans to pay off.
Yep.
And Shawi, if I may add, to the stories that we've started to hear, some of it's really heartbreaking, really. Besides, it seems like for older people, those who are above 60, deciding that they can't afford the revised or the so-called repricing of their insurance policies, deciding that that's it, I'm going to toss in the towel, I can't afford it, I'm going to the public healthcare system because, they wanted to take care of their own healthcare, but they can't afford it anymore. There are also families where very common for parents to take up health policies for their children, now deciding that let's prioritize the children for the health insurance, but for themselves, they omit themselves because they can't afford it. So we have these kind of decisions that are currently being made where for an upper middle income country where we are supposedly asking the middle class to take responsibility to charge of their own healthcare, to make use of healthcare facilities that we have, especially in the private, because we're told that if you can afford it, then avail yourself to the private healthcare. So suddenly we're faced with this decision where they're now saying they can't do it, and think about it, shall we? 70% of the population currently access public healthcare and 30% access private. We can't even afford even a 1% shift from private to public because the public healthcare system right now is overwhelmed already with the existing burden that is placed upon it.
We have an interesting question that was sent in by Go. May I know why the same treatment is much higher if a patient is covered by insurance, sometimes as high as double, thus causing insurance companies to suffer higher payments? I just want to check first, Dato', has FOMCA received feedback from consumers, that shows that this is actually a wider problem as well?
You mean when they are saying that they are insured patients, then they get a higher billing? I mean, because you see, most of the time it's the lack of transparency. How would if I go to a private hospital, I get a bill, I mean, who do I compare it with, So at this moment, what we find is that when people start putting it on social media, and then somebody else then says, hey, I paid cash, and that's where you see the comparison, So in terms of complaints, I think consumers just feel that, they're just surprised that at the end of sometimes a 3-day stay, just doing tests, they end up having a 6,000 or 7,000 ringgit bill for telling them, they don't have COVID, they don't have influenza, they don't have anything, but then they get a 6,000 ringgit bill. And I think that's why, we find that, the government now that, Minister of Health is pushing for DRG, the diagnostic, reference group thing, where, you have a group, you have a reference point. And I think this is something which is good because consumers will have an idea how much would a certain surgery or certain treatment cost before they go in. Now, I think, I'm just going to check, maybe perhaps I may have influenza, I may have dengue, I'm not sure because I'm having flu, fever and all that. But I wouldn't think that I will come out with a 7,000 ringgit bill. So I think that's where, we need to change even the method of how we're being billed in the private hospitals.
Azrul, I want to ask if you want to weigh in on this.
Yeah, this is one of the most frequently asked questions when we're talking about these issues, why is it that when you get admitted into a private hospital, they ask you, do you have insurance or not? And then you suddenly realize there's two separate types of billing, supposedly. And private hospitals will tell you that there is no such thing, that there is no system where, there's two parallel systems, running together.
I have heard the same from private hospitals, that they don't have separate tiers of charges.
And one of the reasons why is because they said that for those who are paying cash, or out of pocket, as it were, as we call it, is being given a discount as compared to those who are paying by insurance. But sometimes the difference can be quite huge, like 100% more compared to somebody who's paying out of pocket. And this is a problem in itself. I beg to differ, Dato'. Actually, it is very transparent, which is probably, if you look at the bill, you have like 14 pages worth of billing for which we barely understand what actually is being billed. I think that's the issue there.
They have to do that because of regulations, right?
The law requires that you itemize each point of billing that you make, even down to the gloves or the use of a wheelchair or a kidney dish. So like in this particular case, we would have to ask, why are those items being billed to a person who has insurance as opposed to a person who doesn't? Because there's obviously a difference there, and whether it's for dengue treatment or cataract surgery and so forth. So unfortunately, I have to say that the private hospitals hasn't really come up with a satisfactory answer on that. And the insurance industry themselves are concerned, because why are you being charged differently for basically the same treatment and level of care? So when we talk to private hospitals also, it seems like this is where a lot of the extra costs or the profits or the revenue comes from these consumables, which make up around 70% of a private hospital's bill. So if you look at it, 20 or 10% or so is drugs and the specialist fees. The specialist fees are regulated, so you cannot go more than a certain amount because it's regulated by law. But the other 70% is where the main billing is, which is not regulated at the moment. And that's where that 100% increase, difference between a person who's paying out of pocket versus somebody who's with insurance, is where there is a difference.
Like you said, private hospitals' rationale is that they are able to waive certain charges or provide discounts for self-paying patients, whereas insured patients have perhaps the benefit or the luxury of sort of the best treatment that can be.
Well, actually, I would argue that's not the case either, because why would there be a difference between the type of care for a person who is paying out of pocket versus somebody who's with insurance? They should be the same sort of care, right? But when you talk to private hospitals, and we have to remind ourselves, even though the word hospital, clinics and so forth conjures up a certain welfare connotation, these are businesses, and that is where they have to make their revenue. That's where the investment comes in. That's where the research and development costs. But also, if they wanted to buy a new MRI machine, for example, this is where the money will have to come from. It won't come out from a person who's having to sell their car or withdraw from the EPR of life savings in order to fund their care. They would rather that this comes out from those who are paying insurance. So it's a little bit of a problematic model there, but it's a free market in Malaysia, and that's what we have currently.
Dato', what would you like to see, or what would FOMCA like to see in terms of oversight of private hospitals' charges?
Yeah, I think there has to be an oversight body made perhaps under the Prime Minister's office, because we need to look at both the insurance industry as well as the private healthcare services. Even for when we talk about even insurance, you have the Financial Services Ombudsman. But again, it is being funded by the industry itself. So the number of complaints, especially in terms
conflict of interest.
Yes,
right?
it's a conflict of interest. And if you look at the annual reports of the Financial Insurance Ombudsman reports, you will see that most of the cases are not in favor of consumers. So consumers are actually not having trust or confidence that their complaints are being addressed. So where do they go? They can't go. So many of them end up telling us, we actually went to Bank Negara, but Bank Negara says go back to Financial Services Ombudsman.
That's a really good question. Where do they go?
Where do they go? So I feel that there has to be an oversight body that particularly looks at both aspects, both the insurance industry in terms of all these premiums and so on, plus looking at regulating the healthcare as well. Of course, then you can also use the existing law, like you have the Private Healthcare Facilities and Services Act. You can make certain amendments there as well. But I think that there has to be an oversight body that kind of includes both sides, where BNM, MOH, relevant industries, patient groups, we have not even talked about, because of this whole issue, I've been talking to so many patient groups, even doctors, and then they tell me that, especially those who, say, for example, have just undergone a breast surgery, treatment, and then 3 months, post-surgery, they're covered with, certain medications which are good to ensure that, it doesn't flare up again. But post 3 months, then the insurance industry says, we're not covering you for continued medication. And their medicines, because it's patented and it's a new innovative drug, it costs about 800 ringgit a month. So what happens to these patients? Because they say, you do an X-ray and you do an MRI, we don't see anything in there, so which means we can't cover you post 3 months. So, and these are things which, we've never thought about, but what happens to these patients, post their surgery? So I think there are a lot of areas that need to be looked at, and this oversight body would look into both their charges and also look into their welfare in that sense.
So Azrul, in some of your statements, you've proposed that a separate regulator similar in role and powers to the Malaysian Competition Commission be established. Would that be similar to the oversight body that Dato's proposing?
Very much so. And I think the key phrase there is consumer protection. Because we lack that at the moment when it comes to the issue of healthcare inflation, because as I mentioned, it seems like the burden is now being placed on the consumer, the patients, to go and figure it out. Like somehow we're supposed to look at the price lists or what charges are in each private hospital and then go shop around like a restaurant, deciding which hospital we're going to be admitted to, and there's a problem there, because the regulator should be doing that. We shouldn't be depending on patients, families, and so forth. But right now we don't have that, because there is no punca kuasa, or there's no regulatory framework or legislation that regulates that 70% I was talking about in terms of the private hospital billing. We have it for the specialist fees. For drugs, we don't have, but it's still not a big percentage there. But today, when we look at consumer protection, who's speaking out when it comes to the insurance issue, for example? Don't forget the achievement, so to speak, quote unquote, that we've been able to get, which is this 10% cap over 3 years, only occurred after there was a lot of pushback, backlash, hue and cry, groups like FOMCA, people like YB Sim, for example, who spoke up, and communicated the concerns and voices of policyholders to the high levels, and it resulted in that. If there was no pushback, then it would have continued on, and there would be like 200, 300% increases, and it wouldn't have changed. So the issue here is, whose job is it? And we need a regulatory framework that looks at those two issues, because right now Bank Negara takes care of, and as they should, the regulations concerning the insurance industry, the regulatory powers in terms of safeguarding the financial aspects of it. But when it comes to consumer protection, I think it's missing there. And it's also unfair to expect Bank Negara to do that. It's also unfair to expect Ministry of Health to do that, because there's no legislation. So today we have a vacuum which needs to be filled with a new commission or regulatory framework to ensure that the consumer protection aspects of medical health inflation is able to be taken care of.
I mean, you say it's unfair because there's no legislation, but that's what Parliament is for, to
course.
Amend and enact new legislation to represent the interests of the rakyat, right? And speaking of the rakyat, we have quite a few comments and questions. One listener saying, we all know the cost is passed down to the rakyat, and pointing out, the expansion of private hospitals, new ones popping up everywhere, is because it's lucrative. And yet the response to this is to increase insurance premiums and for patients to buy in for co-payment. The reasoning for this is so that we take responsibility to double check the bills. But what do I benchmark it against? What's the reference point?
Yeah.
Exactly like you said, Dato.
Yeah.
Let's quickly also look at oversight of the insurance industry, because we started off talking about sort of this is where the industry is coming from, but amid all the talk about regulating private healthcare, do you think that the regulation of the insurance industry needs to be improved? In what areas, Dato?
Bank Negara usually comes up with guidelines, and I think that's where we need some sort of a law, a new piece of legislation to see how we can actually be a bit more holistic in that sense. Just coming out with with the banking industry and the insurance industry guidelines, asking them to follow best practices is not the way forward. There has to be proper regulations. There has to be penalties involved. That was one of the things when I complained to Bank Negara about the banking industry, how they were actually impinging on consumer rights, and then I was quite happy to see after that there were 2 banks that were taken to task by Bank Negara, and where they were penalized for not providing good services to consumers because of their extreme long hours of downtime. And I think that's where we need to also go towards the insurance industry as well. So, instead of just providing guidelines and saying best practices that ideally insurance industry should follow, there has to be certain, penalties involved when the insurance industry is not following through with that. And as I said, the current financial services ombudsman is not of course, at the moment now, that's what's there, that's what's available. But I think there has to be a government-funded, redress mechanism that has to be put in place where consumers can go. As I said, if consumers now are not getting satisfactory resolution from the financial services ombudsman in terms of their insurance cases or even banking cases, there's nowhere the consumers can go unless they take a case in court, and as we know that it's not viable or feasible for them to do that.
Now, coming back though to the conversation that we had started just before the break about regulation of the insurance industry, and Dato', I want to ask, we hear a lot about consumers' pain points, policyholders' pain points as well. And that's always an ongoing conversation about how are my premiums actually calculated? What's the transparency behind you saying that they have to go up in prices? Why are some of my claims not being approved? In terms of some of the issues that you hear from consumers, what areas require strengthened oversight?
I think firstly is the issue of disclosure. Bank Negara actually has come up with a guideline to say that in terms of whatever financial product that you buy, even from the banks or from the insurance industry, that there has to be disclosure, clear disclosure to the policyholder or whoever that's buying the product on, what's the interest rate, what is the penalty if you are in late payment, what do you get, after the lapse, or is there a certain, there has to be a clear information. Those days we used to get our agents writing it in our A4 paper and then they give it to you until you get your policy, But nowadays, what's happening both in banks as well as in the insurance, industry is that these agents now come with their iPad, and then they just show you, pictures and say, with this policy, at the end of the day, you'll get 2 million coverage or 10 million coverage, and then your every 3 years you get certain bonuses. They tell you all the positive things, but they don't tell you that in terms of, if you decide, after the cooling off period that you decide that you want to give up your policy, what happens, And I recently received a complaint during the Christmas holidays when our office was closed, but I was, in the office doing work, and we had this, mother and daughter coming in, and she had bought a financial product from the bank, and she said she actually wanted a savings kind of a product, but actually she ended up with a life insurance product, and the salesperson who was actually from the bank teller, who was known to her because she's been frequenting the bank, did not actually give that information and just said, told the daughter who was supposed to be signing up on the iPad, just sign here, and then you will get your policy. And only later she realized that it was a life insurance product, and then she couldn't cope with the payment. And now when she actually wanted to, give up, she's been told that she'll get a 60% forfeit. Of that, but it's not written apparently in the policy. That's what she told us. So I told her, share with us the documentation before we can take up this matter.
Azrul, anything you want to add on?
I'm one of those, who believes that everybody should have insurance. Insurance, we have to remember, is a form of protection from financial catastrophe. I feel that today, when you look at the kind of costs resulting from healthcare, there's a lot that we don't know about, and sometimes we will need that protection, even though we have the public healthcare system, which we can depend on to help us out. But sometimes we want to be able to avail ourselves for, we can't wait. We need to avail ourselves with immediate for care and treatment and so forth. And this is where insurance is very important. Unfortunately, when it comes to insurance coverage in Malaysia, the penetration is very low. Not enough people have insurance, but also when we see what people have, they don't necessarily have the right type of insurance. They have life insurance, they have critical illnesses, but not necessarily health insurance. Yeah. And so literacy is definitely a problem here, and you expect agents to be able to educate the policyholder or for prospective policyholders to know what they're signing on to, and it may not necessarily be the case. How many of you understood what the A4 paper was about, when they were scribbling down the numbers? I certainly not necessarily the case, but I can tell you here that we need to look at wider issues, bigger issues here, and not just blame. And one of the things that we need to consider is a national health insurance, where everybody is covered with some form of insurance and not just dependent on private health insurance, which we are currently doing right now for a small part of the population.
Yeah, that's a question from Anthony. Can a public health insurance scheme that competes with these private insurance companies be a viable solution? Absolutely.
In fact, that's one of the things that we've been arguing for, because if we have a national health insurance which provides serious competition against private health insurance, it could end up with premiums reducing because it's competing against that. But in order for that to happen, everybody needs to be on board. Everybody needs to be able to pull that risk, pull their resources in order to cover as many people as possible, but also not everybody can pay. So we could to have to subsidize people who can't pay, but it means that more people can be covered, better treatment can be provided, and most importantly, instead of going with this argument that private healthcare is only for those who can afford it, meaning it's code for rich people or upper middle income people and so forth, it's accessible to all. Why can't a person from the lower income household be able to access private hospitals too, if they have the insurance?
Yeah. I always hear this pushback though, when we talk about a sort of national insurance or social insurance scheme. Are you willing to pay more taxes, or are you willing to take a 1% cut out of your salary every month? Dato', what are your thoughts on that?
No, we are also in favor. FOMCA is definitely in favor of some, a national health financing scheme. It could come from even the existing, I would say, scheme. Like, for example, you talk about Perkeso or even EPF. Now, Perkeso already, patients are allowed to go for kidney dialysis using the accessibility to SOCSO. So why not? And all those who are employed are already subscribing to both EPF and SOCSO. You don't have to come up with a new mechanism. You can already use some of this basic mechanism that's already in place, and just maybe add on, maybe 10 ringgit a month, from there. And I think people would be willing to pay if they know that they can actually have access to a good, I would say a good system, because then, as what Azrul was saying, then you have the total population, which means the numbers are there, which means, resources are there because now money is there as well. And, the healthcare professionals, I mean, now you see most of them, they are overworked. And I think some of the mechanism that the government is trying to introduce is going to further, make some of these professionals to perhaps leave. I personally know that, my niece, who is now doing her housemanship, she told me that she joined in May, and in one of the state-based hospitals, and already in the second month, 6 of them left housemanship. So for variety of reasons, but then you see, then you are getting less number of people who are actually in the public healthcare system. And I think if we can actually use this national healthcare financing, you'll have the bigger pool, you'll have the bigger resources, and as what Azrul was saying, there will be that competition, and then private health insurance will become much more affordable in that sense. And our neighboring countries, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, they are all already, Philippines, they are all already going into this kind of social health insurance scheme, and we are lagging behind, unfortunately.
All right. I just want to from the comments that we've been receiving on WhatsApp, I'll wrap up the ones related to private hospitals. A lot of them are listing out sort of the charges that they've received for the line items, disposable underwear, gloves and things like that. So clearly that is a pain point for patients. A couple of comments, questions, we can't address specific questions related to why does a medical card need to be tied with a life insurance policy when a consumer does not need the latter, or tied to an investment which a consumer does not even need. We can't explain why, but clearly these are problems. Actually, they are unnecessarily increasing the cost for consumers.
Actually, Shawi, this is an excellent point, because one of the things that insurance has also asked us to reconsider is how we look at these insurance products too. Only buy what you need. Because basically what's happened is that a lot of the, because you're helping out your cousin or your nephew or your auntie selling insurance, you want to be able to get the Rolls Royce of insurance products, and you end up paying for that. But you don't need that. You only need maybe the health insurance component, which could be like, instead of paying 800 ringgit a month, you end up paying 150 ringgit a month. So what is happening now is also a sort of positive disruption, which is we're looking back at the insurance policies right now and seeing how maybe we can downscale and look at what we should actually be paying for, as opposed to just wholesale, just paying for whatever we were paying for the past 6 or 7 years. So there is a disruption that's happening right now. We don't know what's going to happen at the end of it, but what we do know is that there is medical inflation happening. The health insurance premium increases are not happening in a vacuum here. They're actually responding to something which is increased costs in private healthcare. And there is a role to be played with regards to consumers, but consumers also need to be protected against unfairly unreasonable hikes in insurance and private hospital charges.
One more comment from a listener pointing out that medical insurance coverage is getting ridiculous. Do we really need millions per year? They should have deductible claims. That should be the choice. If consumers are made to pay 5 to 10% of a bill, then the premiums get reduced, which would make people more prudent with medical costs.
That's an excellent point. But you know what? I would argue how much of that premium will be decreased. If it is significant, say if you say 10% co-payment from a bill, and your monthly premium reduces by maybe around 50 ringgit or 60 ringgit, meaning it is a significant decrease, then that's okay. But what if it's a 10% co-payment and it just decreases by a few ringgit.
Yep.
So that's an issue then, and it needs to be worked out properly, because deductibles, how much deductible?
Exactly.
Is it, mine said 10,000 ringgit. Nobody can afford a deductible at 10,000 ringgit.
Yep.
So we need to have this discussion. It's very important for us to have a reasonable compromise here, balancing in the interests of patients, consumers, and policyholders, as well as the interests of insurance and private hospitals.
Yeah, and transparency of all these kinds of calculations. It makes me think this is why parents tell their kids to study actuarial science, because it's a very lucrative profession.
The most expensive course too, if I'm not mistaken.
But jokes aside, maybe we need to wrap up our conversation and just try to be constructive in looking forward. Obviously, we know that it's just kicking the can down the road. The Band-Aid solution that you mentioned earlier, Dato', in terms of this cap. Okay, we know what will happen after 2026 realistically, but what do you want to see happen? What can be prioritized by the government to address all these issues we discussed today?
Yeah, for me, I think that oversight body has to be in place, and so in tandem with that, the relevant laws, if there has to be a new act, or there has to be some sort of an amendment, it has to come in play. And even when we talk about even medicines, Azrul, you mentioned that it's about 30%, but again, these are all patented drugs. What about using generic medicines? They're equally efficacious. There's equal efficacy in that sense. So I think we need to also look at it holistically. There has to be a change in the way that how we look at the healthcare policy itself. Why does it have to be all patented drugs? And we also want to build our local industry. Here we have got pharmaceutical industries here as well, MOPI, but they are not incentivized or encouraged to develop these medicines because of the patents that's been involved. So I think we need to look at the whole system, not only the financing, but also looking at how we can, look at the services, and how we can also look at the pharmaceutical aspect as well, for us to move forward. If not, as I said, our consumers, not only in terms of financial insecurity, where they become financial bankrupts because of, loans and so on, but also because of the medical bankruptcy as well, where they're out of pocket, they're not able to, they start taking money from Arlongs to pay, just say, suddenly somebody in the family gets a heart attack and so on, and, you're not able to make those payments. So I think we need to look at it holistically in order for us to move forward.
Azrul, any final thoughts?
Well, I certainly wholeheartedly agree to the idea of setting up a separate statutory commission that will look at the protecting the interests of consumers when it comes to both the issue of health insurance as well as private hospital charges. We definitely need that. We need the different pieces of legislation in order for that to happen, but also for us to also, as consumers, to also play a role in calling to account, demanding for transparency, and not basically staying quiet when it comes to these issues.
Trust me, they're not staying quiet.
Yeah, I can see that, and that's great. That's what we need, because change can only happen if it happens when everybody speaks out, in order for people up there to know what the concerns are, and for there to be reasonable change to happen. Well, if it's silent, then there will not be any change.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today, Dato' Indrani Thuraisingham, Vice President of FOMCA, and of course my co-host, Azrul Muhammad Khalib, CEO of the Galen Centre for Health and Social Policy. This has been Health and Living with me, T. Shawiq, on BFM 89.9.